I can.
That's good. Good afternoon. I'm going to give you a brief description of who we are. Reform Elections Now is an informal, nonpartisan association of mostly business and law school alumni. We were initially motivated by a thesis of business executive Catherine Gale and Harvard professor Michael Porter that the current politics industry is a duopoly with negative impacts affecting US business competitiveness. They identified election processes as a major part of the problem, disincenting constructive government action. Our team has been working for 3 years to understand and educate ourselves and others how to include civic engagement as part of our responsibility as citizens. Our mission is to facilitate election reform through education and engagement with practical solutions that enhance informed discourse, increase voter participation, and basically motivate better representation by our public officials. The high turnout for this year's election reflects both an interest and a concern for how our government functions, with many questioning the fairness of both the process and its results. It's our fervent hope that you will not forget the uncertainty and angst of this election. We cannot afford to be too exhausted, but must continue to seek reforms that can make our democracy and government work better. For those of us in New York, and New York City particularly, we supported an election innovation for ranked choice voting, which was voted into law a year ago and will be used in several key elections in 2021. In February, there's a vote for Queens City Council, and then later in the year for mayor and other key positions. We hope you will be back with us during 2021 when we shall explore election innovation in more detail with our monthly presentations on election reform. The problems of political polarization and disenfranchisement of moderates and independents in our election processes have not gone away after November 3rd, nor with the Electoral College vote this week. This afternoon's program will deal with the increased polarization that we are experiencing. For today's Zoom, we have something close to 100 registrants, but we're keeping the Zoom open rather than using a more restrictive webinar format. Please keep your microphones muted, at least until we get to the discussion part of the program. Because of the large number of attendees, we would appreciate your submitting questions using the chat tab, which our teammate Herb Kaplan will curate. In some cases, he may ask you to pose your question by unmuting your microphone. You may also choose to share text comments via the same chat function. Our presenter this afternoon is Peter Cyrus. He is the Reform Elections Now Director of Research, but also an active contributor to many Harvard alumni activities, particularly supporting social enterprise, and a published author of popular fiction and nonfiction works. He hates long introductions, but our Reform Elections Now team wants to express our gratitude for his insights and careful research, which inform our presentations. I now turn the meeting over to Peter.
Thanks, Mike. Can people hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today's presentation is how to unite the ununited states of America. Now, the United States is a very divided country. In the United States, we have many clear divisions: Republicans versus Democrats, Trump versus Biden, college versus high school educated, new versus old economy, urban versus rural, black versus white, MSNBC and CNN versus Fox and Newsmax, coastal versus flyover states. But there is only one divide you need to consider if you want to truly understand the political and cultural split in the United States. And that's Whole Foods Market versus Cracker Barrel Country Store. Now, in 2020, Joe Biden won 95% of the counties with a Whole Foods but no Cracker Barrel. And Donald Trump won 82% of the counties with a Cracker Barrel, but no Whole Foods. That's really all you need to know about the division in this country. The cultural divide between Whole Foods and Cracker Barrel fully describes the divide in the country and in the recent election. But now let's turn to the election. 2020 should have been a landslide for Democrats. In 2020, Democrats were running against the president with the highest unfavorability ratings ever recorded in a stagnating economy because of a pandemic where infections were reaching new highs every day, not disappearing as the president had promised, and they were spending almost twice as much as Republicans. Polls showed the Democrats were going to win the presidency by a large margin, win the Senate, enlarge the majority in the House, win more governorships, and take control of more state legislatures. It was going to be a landslide for the Democrats. But 2020 was not a good year for the Democrats. Yes, the Democrats won the popular vote, but by a surprisingly low margin. They gained one seat in the Senate so far, with Georgia still in play. They lost seats in the House, including many swing areas they had gained in 2018, with the worst result for the party of any new president since 1960. They lost the governorship. They lost control of 2 state legislatures, so that the Republicans now control 69 legislative chambers compared to 37 for Democrats. Now, the polls vastly underestimated votes for the Republican. Trump's margin in all the polls was underestimated in 48 of the 50 states. In 10 states, it was by double digits. And for those of you who are in New York, no state was underestimated more than New York, 17.5%. So it wasn't just the flyover states where people missed how well Trump was going to do. And the Republicans were underestimated in competitive Senate races, often by large margins. Voters didn't ditch Mitch or Lindsey. Democrats lost seats they expected to win. I don't know where the pollsters went wrong, but if you look, the average underestimation for Trump was 4.8%, and the average underestimation in the Senate race was 6.6%. Those are big numbers. In the words of the hardly Republican-leaning Washington Post, Democrats blew it. Prior to the election, the nonpartisan Cook Political Report classified 26 congressional seats as lean Republican, 36 as lean Democrat, and 27 as toss-ups. The Republicans won all of the lean Republican seats with an average victory margin of 12%. That's a big number. The Democrats lost 7 of the 36 lean Democrat and only had an average margin of 4%. But the Republicans won all 27 toss-up races. The average margin was 6%, and 5 of those races had double-digit margins. I can't find another election in which all the toss-up races were won by one party. As I said, the Washington Post said the Democrats blew it. And the Democrats are already sniping at each other. Abigail Spanberger from Virginia said, "We need not ever use the word socialist again. If we are classifying Tuesday as a success, we will get effing torn apart." I don't know what those missing letters are, but I don't think it's good. Schrader from Oregon said Democratic messaging is terrible. Slotkin from Michigan said our tactical fights could lead to real strategic failure for our country, whereas Rashida Tlaib and AOC are basically yelling at the others, saying you're trying to blame the movement for Black Lives for their loss. The Democrats are badly divided, and it's going to get worse. Restricting is going to really hurt the Democrats. 188 seats will be redistricted by Republicans, 73 by Democrats, and 141 by independent commissions or divided governments. 7 seats are in single districts. The Republicans gained New Hampshire. The Democrats lost Virginia, which adopted a bipartisan commission. So control of redistricting by Republicans is going to hurt Democrats for the next decade. Now, Republicans also lost the 2020 election. They hitched their future to Trump. Trump lost. Don't tell him, but I'm going out on a limb and predicting he lost. Republicans no longer stand for free enterprise, balanced budgets, small government, and free trade. Instead, they stand for anti-globalization. The Chinese took our jobs. Anti-immigration, build a wall, fear of the new economy, minorities taking their place, white lives should matter too, wanting respect from the political elites. These are not deplorables, rednecks, or white trash. They built America. Now they're being ignored. Funding, not defunding the police. Defunding the police, probably the worst campaign slogan in history. Capitalism, not socialism. And the Republican Party is now the party of Donald Trump. Because Trump may run again, other Republican leaders and traditionally Republican ideas will be on hold until Trump or Trump Jr. has left the scene. I know some of you are Eric Trump fans. I'm not trying to exclude him. There's a typo here. The Republicans and many independents don't trust the election results. Sorry for the typo. 71% of Republicans think the election was not free and fair. 41% of the independents think the election was not free and fair. Now, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent, we can't afford to have elections where 38% of the total voters, 41% of the independents, and 71% of the Republicans think the election is not free and fair. And for people who watch right-wing media, this election will never be over. In the past 3 weeks, polls have been released. The CNBC Change poll, 73% view Trump as the rightful winner and say Trump should never concede. In the 7-letter poll, 79% of Trump voters believe the election was stolen. And in the Newsmax poll, 98.9% said Trump should not concede to Biden. These voters are going to carry with them the view that the election was stolen. So we'd like to ask everybody a question. But the first question we're going to ask, and all results are going to be anonymous. Now that Biden has won the Electoral College, will you accept him as the legitimate president? You can answer yes, no, or no answer. Herb has put the poll up, and let's see what kind of answers we get.
Okay, I'll take the poll down in about a minute. So if you want to cast your vote, do it now.
Okay, I think, so we're voting 76 yes, 0 no, 0 no answer. Okay, so let's see. The Washington Post asked the same question to Republican members of Congress. Let's see how they voted. If Biden wins the Electoral College, will you accept him as a legitimately elected president? Yes, 32, no 2, no answer, 215. So 100% of our participants say that Joe Biden is the legitimately elected president, as opposed to 13% of the Republican representatives. No comment. Now, Democrats lost the election they thought they would win, and Republicans lost the presidency, but independents could be the biggest losers. They're stuck between two parties that won't work together or agree on anything, forced to abide by choices of the two parties in states that have restrictions on voting in primaries. Like in New York, Florida, and Pennsylvania and others, independents are barred from participating in primaries. So if the Democrats select a left-wing progressive and the Republicans select a right-wing Trumpist, independents who are often the largest voting group, have no candidate to whom they can relate. Now, while trust in elections is abysmal, trust in the federal government is also near historic lows. Look at the chart here. In the mid-1960s, over 70% of Americans, 77% to be exact, trusted their government. As recently as 2004, 54% of Americans trusted their government. Now, according to Pew Research, only 20% of Americans trust their government. How does a government function if only 20% of the population trusts it? And the US lags most developed countries in government trust. Trust if according to Statista, we rank second to last in government trust. While 84% of the Chinese and 70% of the Indians trust their government, only 33% of Americans do so. So whether it's the 20% number that Pew came up with or the 30% number for Statista, either result is worrisome. Now, besides losing trust in elections and losing trust in government, Americans have also lost trust in each other. The percentage of US citizens who trust each other has dropped from 83% to 56% over the past 44 years. And the percentage who believe in the wisdom of the people to make political decisions has dropped from 64% to 34%. So we can't trust our government, we can't trust our elections, and we can't trust each other. How can a country thrive if people don't trust each other? And we don't trust our media as well. In 1972, 70% of Americans trusted media. They watched Walter Cronkite or Huntley Brinkley or something like that. Now only 40% trust their media. And what's worse, each distrusts the other's news source. 75% of conservative Republicans trust Fox. 77% of liberal Democrats distrust Fox. 70% of liberal Democrats trust CNN. 67% of conservative Republicans distrust CNN. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. So how can people ever agree if they distrust the media that others trust? Look, we can't even agree on COVID. So they gave you, here are two choices. The government has controlled the outbreak as much as it could, or the government has not controlled the outbreak as much as it could. 90% of Fox viewers say the government has controlled the outbreak as much as it could. 97% of CNN, MSNBC, and NPR viewers say the government has not controlled the outbreak as much as it could. You can't get more divided than this. If Americans can't agree on a health emergency, what can they agree on? Now, Republicans and independents don't trust the media. In 1989, there was not much of a difference in trust between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. But over the past 21 years, independents have decreased their trust from 55 to 36%, and Republicans from 55 to 16%. That's pretty weak numbers. And this problem started way before Donald Trump. The lack of trust of both Republicans and independents is a serious problem. And distrust has gotten worse. As I said, the problem started well before Trump, but since 2016, trust in all media, including Fox, by Republicans has declined. Trust in all media by all adults has declined. And this is one I don't completely get. Democrats have a higher level of trust in the Wall Street Journal than do Republicans. The Wall Street Journal is hardly a Democratic rag. Now, we can't even agree on basic facts. 73% of Republicans and Democrats say they can't agree on basic facts. With low trust and no agreement on facts, they do agree that it's much harder to solve problems. And you can combine this with rising income inequality, which impacts both sides. As you can see from the charts on the right, we have income inequality in the United States has been rising dramatically, and we have the highest income inequality of any of the G7 countries. Now, white working class voters tend to support Republicans, while minority working class voters support Democrats, but they both face the same problems of income, healthcare, education, and failing to achieve what was once the American dream. They both feel the inequality, but have different views of how it should be overcome. This is a cancer for both parties. And things could get worse. Republicans feel the election was not fair and don't trust what they hear. And Trump and right-wing media will keep stoking the flames. The progressives are going to push the Democrats left, defund the police, Black Lives Matter, Medicare for all. Both parties feel the government isn't working for them, and independents will feel even more disenfranchised. Yet government responds to lobbyists who represent the interests of the elite. Both sides are right when they say the government is not working for them. Now, here's the irony. Both sides want the same things, but they're frightened by the solutions of the others. Both sides want a government that listens to them, better health care and drug treatment, jobs that will enable them to earn a good living, better and cheaper education, better roads and infrastructure, lower crime rates, respect for who they are and what they do, a belief that the next generation will be more successful than the current one, and a chance to live the American dream. Yet each is frightened of the solutions of the other. What America needs is a strategy to bring people together and increase understanding. The divide is fixable, but all Americans have to mobilize to help. If we want to restore trust in elections, government, media, and in each other, all Americans, especially moderates and independents, have to step up and act. If moderates remain quiet and allow the wings of both parties to dominate, things will get worse. We need to work together to improve the election process, have fairer and more competitive races, increase bipartisanship, enact programs that benefit members of both parties, listen to different media outlets to gain a broader point of view, and listen to each other so we can share a common dream. Now, the first step is to restore trust in elections. We can't have 70 some odd percent of Republicans and 41% of independents questioning these election results. We need to take steps to ensure that all Americans trust the result of our elections. These could include establishing a national voter directory, providing federal financing to states to improve their voting databases, creating safe standards for mail-in voting, encouraging states to allow more early voting processing and counting, so we're not going through this thing, oh, Trump's leading by 22 points, and suddenly 3 million mail-in votes show up for Biden. It's a fraud. Eliminating impediments to registering and voting, and agreeing on the rules of the voting process. If we can make our voting systems work better and agree on the rules, we can increase trust in elections. We need to have fairer and more competitive elections. That will help restore trust in government. We should end party restrictions on voting in primaries, support voting systems like ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries that could provide more choice and lead to the elections of more candidates willing to govern in a bipartisan manner. Eliminate gerrymandering to restore the concept of one person, one vote, and enact laws on political spending so we know who is financing our election and influencing our officials. Having fairer and more competitive elections in which everyone has a chance to participate is an important step in increasing trust in government. And we need to increase bipartisanship. Pure partisanship is not working. And Americans are sick of the partisan bickering between the two parties. To increase trust in government, we should support bipartisan legislation and support elected officials who will work across the aisle to benefit the country. We also need to enact programs that benefit working Americans of both parties. We should focus on enacting programs that benefit both Republicans and Democratic working voters, improving infrastructure, creating training programs for 21st century jobs, giving all Americans a living wage, increasing spending on education, including pre-K and daycare, and reducing the cost of health care, including addiction programs. If government enacts programs that benefit both parties, trust can be increased. And finally, we need to restore trust in media by flipping the dial in some other ways. Now, Americans will never trust each other or their government until we restore trust in media. There are two ways to accomplish this. First, government can pass legislation requiring fairness and equal time, as was the rule in the past, so people can be exposed to both sides of an argument. Secondly, individuals can watch more middle-of-the-road media and learn how to flip the dial. If you're a Fox viewer, turn on CNN or MSNBC every few days. If you're an MSNBC or CNN viewer, watch Fox every few days. Try to understand what the other side is saying. They may not be completely crazy. And avoid getting your news from social media sites like Facebook and Twitter. Just because somebody with a social media account asserts something does not make it so. I don't know if you saw my Facebook account, but I asserted that I was going to be playing for the New York Knicks in the 2021 season. I will confess that's not true. And finally, restore trust in each other by listening. Talk to people who have different points of view. If you're an urban Democrat, when was the last time you talked to a rural Republican? If you're a rural Republican, when was the last time you talked to an urban minority? If you shopped at Whole Foods, when was the last time you patronized Cracker Barrel? And vice versa. Don't think of people on the other side as deplorables or socialists. They're Americans, and their aspirations may not be much different from yours. Talk to people with a sense of hope instead of a sense of despair. People can express their views in angry and partisan ways or in positive and hopeful ways. Positive and hopeful is much more effective. Now, before I tell you why, we just have two poll questions. So the second poll question, which Herb's going to put up, is of these issues that we've talked about, trust in elections, trust in government, trust in media, and trust in each other, which of these trust issues is the biggest threat to our country? So we're going to vote on that one first.
About 2/3 of the people have voted, so I'm going to give you another 10 seconds to vote, and then we'll show you the results.
Very interesting.
Okay, here we are.
So trust in each other is number one, trust in government number two, trust in elections number three, and trust in media number four. Okay. Now let's turn to the second poll. Which of these issues can be most improved in the next 4 years?
Okay, I'll give you another 5 or 10 seconds for.
Peter, I want to vote all.
You can.
On
Okay,
both of them.
here we are. Peter, here
I'm
we are.
serious. I want to
But-
vote all.
It's very, this is really interesting because except for Marvin who voted all. If I remember, can you put both polls up, Herb?
I'm not sure I can.
Okay. Um,
I can,
the,
I,
just
I think it's only one poll to share at a time.
in the first poll, trusting each other was the biggest problem. And yet, as we talk about what we can solve, trusting each other, you only got 14% of the vote. The one thing that people do seem to think is that we can solve trust in elections, with trust in government coming in second. And nobody thinks that we can solve trust in media. So it's very, very interesting. I actually made a bet with Herb, and I bet that trusting each other was going to come in first in the first poll, and trust in elections was going to be the issue that we could improve the most, with trust in government coming in second. So thank you all for enabling me to win the big money off of Herb.
Can we trust you to pay them?
No. Now, I'd like to talk about, before we go on and conclude, I'd like to talk about my favorite historical event. Because I believe that in politics, we are approaching each other with anger and often condescension. But the same points can often be made if we approach each other with hope and promise. And we can understand the difference between anger and hope by rereading, another typo, sorry, one of the most famous speeches in American history. On August 28, 1963, I was fortunate enough to be standing on the Lincoln Memorial. And Martin Luther King had written an angry speech for the March on Washington. In the middle of his speech, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson yelled at Martin that he was losing his audience, and then yelled, "Tell him about the dream." Martin paused, shoved his written speech to the side, and started to speak extemporaneously. He had said these words on other occasions, but had never said these exact words. And these words became among the most well-known in our history. Both parts of this speech deal with the same issue, but do it in very different ways. So let's just take a minute to look at the two parts of the speech and see what they tell us about communicating with each other. This is the written speech. We've come to our nation's capital, cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note. America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro a bad check, which has come back marked insufficient funds. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. There will neither be rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies cannot gain lodging. And then he keeps talking. Now here Mahalia yells at him. He pushes his speech to the side and says what words that we now all know. I have a dream that one day this nation will live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. And this will be the day when all God's children will be able to sing with new meaning. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And when this happens, we will be able to speed up the day when all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestant and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual. Free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. My point is simple. The angry speech is forgettable. The hopeful extraneous speech, extemporaneous speech is history. And I believe that we can have a dream where Americans can learn to trust their government. Politicians can work to help all citizens instead of catering to special interests. Elections can be fairer and more competitive, and their results will be accepted and trusted. People can agree on a shared set of American facts. People from different backgrounds begin to trust each other and agree that all lives matter. Political polarization will disappear, and all people will work together to form a more perfect union. And people of different political views can work together to help achieve the American dream. In order to realize this dream, we must start to listen and understand each other's points of view and convince our political leaders to do the same. The U.S. is facing one of the greatest crises since the Civil War. Our citizens no longer trust elections, the federal government, the media, or each other. The 2 major parties are at war with each other. People can't even agree on basic facts. This is not the time to focus on narrow interests. This is the time to focus on how to restore the American dream so people will work together. We have provided some suggestions, but we know there are many other choices. And in the next several presentations that we make, we will focus on each of these choices. The first step, however, is for people to try to understand each other so we can rebuild trust in our elections, our government, our media, our country, and each other. Our country deserves better than the political squabbling and divisiveness that have dominated our political system. We cannot keep living in the ununited states. We must make this country united again. Thank you all very much for attending.
Hi, it's Herb Kaplan, a member of the Reform Elections Now team. Peter, thank you for another wonderful and thought-provoking presentation. I just want to say before we open it up to questions that the PowerPoint presentation that you just saw, as well as a recording of this event, will be available probably as soon as tomorrow. And if you wish to get either or both, you can go to info@reformelectionsnow.org and request a copy, and we'll be happy to get it to you. And I believe if you go to our website, reformelectionsnow.org, you probably can find that email address. But again, it's info@reformelectionsnow.org. Now, we'd like to open it up to questions and comments. 2 ways to do that is you can ask your question in the chat box. And also, if you wanted to go to the participants panel and click on the raise hand icon at the bottom of that panel, I will see that you want to ask a question, and we'll get to you. So I now invite everybody to.
I need to intercede. I don't think the info@reformelectionsnow.org works. So I think I think we have to stick with going to the website, and the presentations will be available there.
Okay. So
I'll try to get that email address to work properly too, with Jade's help.
okay. Now I'm looking at the chat box, and maybe Mike, you can help me here.
Yeah, I think we might want to start with Richard Kane's question, which is,
Sure.
it sounds like a partisan question from a Democrat.
Only a recent Democrat, first of all. So, Peter, my question is this. The Reform Elections now maintains that they are a nonpartisan organization. And yet, when I looked at your slides, your list of steps to take, and then a slide or two later, your list of programs to support, all of those virtually come out of the Democratic platform, and none of them come out of the Republican platform. So how do we get people to address that huge dichotomy in points of view about the way we ought to run the country?
What are you talking?
You had two slides about halfway through the presentation.
Yeah.
After you presented all the background, you said, here's a list of steps we should take. And then the next slide, or two slides after that, there was a list of programs to support.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, first of all, if you look at the first group of suggestion, which is about the election, I mean, that's really designed for Republicans and independents. What do they need to believe that the election is fair?
But my point is that, you started off with sort of, I forget exactly what the words were, but essentially making voting equitable, allowing everybody to vote, increase the opportunity for voting, all of that good stuff. And the Republicans have been absolutely opposed to every state. In fact, to the contrary, they've been working hard to resist every one of those steps. How do we fix that?
Well, some of these things, if we look at the steps, for example, the first one is establishing a national voter registry. The point of a national
Republicans
voter
don't want to do that.
What?
The Republicans don't want to do that. That will make it easier to expand the voting rolls, which is, the Republicans have stated that expanding the voting rolls is contrary to their opportunities to grow.
I disagree. I think that some of these steps, like a national voter registry, will eliminate risk of fraud. I mean, the real thing, and some of the questions of mail-in voting, what's interesting about mail-in voting is mail-in voting has traditionally been a Republican. More Republicans have traditionally voted by mail than Democrats. It was this election that the Republicans have been upset about mail-in voting, but there are some issues with mail-in voting, and the systems need to be improved. So I don't think, maybe I see Robin Weaver has raised her hand. Robin, do you have any comments on this?
Well, I understand, what Richard is saying, but as a Republican, I'd like to say that, obviously we want everyone who's entitled to vote. And one of the, I think, promising things for me as a registered Republican was the fact that so many voters who traditionally vote as a Democrat or vote for Democrat candidates voted for Republicans. And I'm specifically referring, for example, to African-American voters, to Hispanic voters. President Trump got about 30% of the Jewish vote. So I find that encouraging. And I would like to think as Republicans, we want everyone who's entitled to vote to be able to vote. So we want to make sure if you are, a U.S. citizen and you're registered in a state and you've followed all the voter registration rules, that you certainly have the opportunity to vote. So I would just say that. I mean, I understand Richard's argument, and that is sort of, I think, if you don't mind my saying this, it's sort of a Democrat view of how Republicans view voters' right to vote. And I have a brother who's a liberal Democrat, and he always raises that argument with me. But I would counter and say that as a Republican, we certainly want everyone who's entitled to vote. And I think it's very important as a Republican that we reach out to voters who traditionally haven't voted Republican. So, everyone should have a chance to vote. And I think it's important that both parties have an opportunity to present their platforms and explain those platforms to the voters.
Yeah, I think, Richard, you're confusing getting on the registry, which is trying to control who's registered and being able to ensure the credibility and quality of the registration rolls, with increasing the number of people registered, and particularly indiscriminately, which is what Republicans fear.
I mean,
And some Democrats fear that too.
look, here's the reality of the issues. If you talk about, if you go to further where I'm talking about better education or better health care, Republicans and Democrats will completely disagree on how to get better health care. You know, one group it's socialized medicine, and but the point is that both Republicans and Democrats want better health care. It's just a question of, can somebody find a way to describe it in a way that's acceptable to both? And my concern about the election was that with the pandemic, there were so many moving pieces that people began to distrust whether the election was fair. And we can't have that again.
Peter, it's Herb Kaplan. When you say that it's a matter, and use healthcare, I think, as an example, it's a matter of defining it or describing it in a way, in the right way. I don't think so. I think that it's okay for there to be different ideas about how you go about solving a problem. The problem with us today is that unlike the past, we aren't willing to compromise these different points of view, and the situation is so toxic today that if a good-minded Republican or Democrat chose to try to work across the aisle, that person is going to be primaried in the next primary election, and that's poison. We have to get to a point where there will always be different ideas, but we have to get to a point where they can work together and compromise to get solutions and move on.
Yeah, I agree with her. I have, can I ask a question which is somewhat different from Richard's question? Can I ask a question or a comment?
Yes.
Well, one of the things I've been concerned about was the judicial process. And, I have a lot of friends who are, Democrats, probably on the very liberal side. And one of their concerns has been the judiciary, particularly with the Supreme Court appointees. And whether or not you agree or disagree with the fact that, President Trump was able to get Amy Coney Barrett approved and through the process, I think it's important for all voters to understand we have 9 justices who, in my opinion, are all qualified. I may not agree with their judicial philosophy and so forth, but I found it very refreshing that you had a situation where the Supreme Court just last week, decided not to go forward with some of the election fraud charges that were being brought by the Texas Attorney General and so forth. And I think people need to understand that just because a judge is appointed by a Democrat or a Republican doesn't mean there's a level of independence. And I think it was particularly reassuring, I would hope, for Democrats to understand that Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett, are not looking at this through a political lens. And, I just think it's really important that people respect the 9 justices and how they view things, not through a partisan lens. And I think that has been one area where both parties have looked at the other with great suspicion. So I found it hopeful that you had this kind of judicial result. And I'm hoping that everyone is paying attention to that and understanding the role of the judiciary. So I guess I have more of a comment than a question, but I just think that was a really important development last week. So I wanted to express.
Well stated.
Can I make a comment here? I think one of the issues I would love to adopt what Robin has said about voting, and that everybody who's entitled to vote. But that's the crux of the problem, because I'm from Wisconsin. I just listened to 6 hours the other day of an analysis There was supposed to be a nonpartisan analysis of the voting. And the bottom line was the Democrats left shortly into the hearing. It was all lament, and it was throwing under the bus our Wisconsin Elections Commission. The bottom line was whether it was indefinite confinement or mailboxes or democracy in the park where we could drop off our ballots or absentee ballots. The argument was none of those people who voted by any of those means was entitled to vote. And the entire 5 hours, 6 hours went on about the fact that all of those conditions were not passed by our legislature. Therefore, they were invalid. They were not alleging fraud. They were alleging that those were invalid votes because they had not been legislatively mandated. Therefore, the solution is, they said, is to now codify all those restrictions into the voting so that people cannot do the kind of voting they did under this. Now, in Wisconsin, our legislature was mentioned by the Supreme Court in a dissent. We haven't met for 8 months here, and almost no legislature in the country had rules for how to deal with a pandemic. And yet the Supreme Court, and I'm an attorney here, so the Supreme Court has basically said in case after case, not this last case, it was a whole different situation, but case after case that's come up to them about COVID, is that if the legislature didn't have the law in place, it was not legitimate. And there is the crux. And I'm in one of the most gerrymandered states in the union. And if we don't get our redistricting right, and right now the Republicans have filed to take it out of our circuit court, the redistricting dispute that there will be, if they have said that the People's Maps Commission that our governor put out that's getting comments throughout the entire state is wrong, and that this should never go to the trial court or the Court of Appeals. The redistricting dispute should go right to the Supreme Court and something called an original action, and that there should be no public input, because the only people who should be able to testify in this litigation would be the governor, Republican Party, and the legislators. It's this isolated view that until the legislator speaks, voters don't have the right. And that was the crux of all of Trump's lawsuits. And it was the crux of all the cases that went to the state courts. And it was the crux of all the cases that went to the Supreme Court, except for this last one. This last one, literally, they had no option but to rule the way they did, frankly. And there is an ideology that's operating in most courts that doesn't necessarily make their decisions inadequate at times. Obviously, we all have partisan differences about that. But the very fact that the Supreme Court ruled the way it just did is not reflective of all the cases it's turned down about religion and discrepancies about voting throughout the states. Especially the Pennsylvania case. You might want to go back and look at that and what it did for Pennsylvania. So we've got redistricting issues, and until that's changed and we get legislators that allow people to really speak and define who is really an eligible voter, we're not going to be able to turn around most of what you talked about.
Okay. Now, I consider Wisconsin to be the worst political state in.
It's horrible.
And the reason is very simple. In the 2018 election, the Democrats won 52.5% of the vote, the Republicans 44% of the vote for the state legislature. So the Democrats won by 8.5%, and the Republicans won 63 seats compared to 36 for the Democrats. And one of the things, and when I talked about removing gerrymandering, and so we can return to one person, one vote, if you have a state, and as it happened mostly to the disadvantage of Democrats, but I would feel the same way if it was the other way around, that in a state like Wisconsin, where the Democrats won a large majority and elected the governor, the Republicans have almost 2/3 of the seats in the legislature. And the point is that that's one of the reasons that we are strongly in favor of independent commissions to handle gerrymander, to handle districting, so that we get rid of gerrymandering. I can't go back and relitigate the presidential election. And you are right, Joan, that first thing the Republicans did when they gained control of the legislature in 2018 was pass a law that took 230,000 voters off the list, and most of them were Democrats. But this is the kind of attitude that we have to get away from.
But the reason that existed is that in 2011, when the census came out, they went in secret to a law office in Madison and did the redistricting in secret and passed it. And it was under Scott Walker. We can't get an independent commission here because of the legislature. We can't get ranked choice. We can't get the national popular vote because of the legislature.
Well,
it all goes back.
But other states have had amendments, constitutional amendments, to set up redistricting commissions, and they have been voted on and succeeded. And that would be a step for Wisconsin.
Well, it's interesting. I'm right now on the Dane County Redistricting Commission. We are trying to do nonpartisan maps in Dane County that we would then try to expand out through the state. But
you're not going to.
I just read the brief today by the Republicans that went to the Supreme Court, and they have just literally dismissed out of hand any voter attempts to have input.
Look, it's simple. If politicians draw their own election districts, you're never going to have something that's fair. That's why we are strongly in favor of independent commissions to draw election districts.
I agree. It's getting there.
It's not easy. But I think we are moving in the right direction, and I hope we can make significant.
I wanted to make a comment. I see Lee Noel wrote that Trump got 10.1 million more votes in 2020 than he got in 2016. Yet there was no evidence before the election of this. And that was my point with the slide that talked about how under polled Trump and the Republicans were. And we ought to take a look and try to understand why the Trump voters saying they would no longer vote for Trump and then they vote for Trump, why this keeps happening. There is clearly some form of prejudice in the way the polls are being taken. We have to understand each other better. Those people, so 70 million, those 10 million more people, those 70 million people who voted for Trump, they are reasonable people. They are not deplorables or rednecks.
You know, one interesting takeaway on that is that in a year with a pandemic, when it could have been predicted that voter turnout wouldn't be at record levels, it was at record levels. And I guess for all kinds of reasons, people were motivated to get out and vote, whether it was in person or by mail, but they sure voted in record numbers. And that's why both Trump can say that he got the 73 million, whatever that number was, votes, and Biden can say that he got 78 million plus. I think it's a testament to people wanting to vote, which is a good thing.
Can I mention one of the questions that's in the chat box that I think is a good one? And it's looking at the profiles of the people in the Zoom screen and saying, are there ways we can get more younger people involved in the cause? I do know there's some young people on the call. I think it's a good point, though, that we should work on it. I'm working on my grandchildren, and I think they're definitely more interested than I was at their age. But I think it is something we all need to do. to work on the younger generation and get them to understand and to see possibilities for improvement.
Agreed.
Peter, can you hear me? Steve
Yes.
here.
Hi, Steve.
I receive an enormous amount of literature from the Democratic Party as well as the Republican Party because I like to be on their list. And the Democratic Party seems to be totally out of this world when it comes to issues. I hardly ever received any literature from them that dealt with actual issues. They'd ask for money, they'd talk about flipping seats, and you would never get an issue. And you know, if anyone wonders why people did not vote for the Democratic Party in such large amounts, you've got to see how they're communicating. And they're not communicating whatsoever. I find the Republicans do a far better job communicating their position. I don't happen to be a Republican, and I support, more or less Roosevelt type democracy. But I am appalled at whoever is in charge of the Democratic Party's, political positions as they're communicating it to the public. It just doesn't exist.
Well, that may be, as I said, why the Democrats lost. Because while Biden won, the Democrats lost. And part of the reason is that, they may not have been talking about things that voters wanted to hear.
I see that Harry Nam has his hand raised. Harry, do you want to ask your question or make your comment?
Yeah, I did. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, hey, Harry, how are you? Peter, again, thanks for the insightful and dynamic presentation. And, my thing is, it's more of a comment and something I've been struggling with for a while. And the poll actually kind of, made a point of making that struggle worse, in that the role of media and what can we actually even do anything about it. It seems, especially in this election cycle, and maybe, I don't know if it's any worse than others, but it certainly seems so that, with the polarization of the media and the fact that in some ways media across all mediums, whether it's print, television, web-based, seems to take the extreme points of view, either on the left or on the right, and that you don't get a real balanced. And so that's why, to Peter's point in this presentation, it's MSNBC, CNN, New York Times versus Fox, Newsmax, you can argue some other, right? There are these extremes. And until we get rid of these echo chambers built around these extremes, if I had $1 for every time I heard just walking down the street, I spent the weekend at my grandparents or with my parents or with my kids, and all they would watch was CNN, or all they would watch was Fox, and that some consumption of media and opinions and positions are all based on these sort of polarized extreme positions. And then the poll we just took, if everybody remembers, I think one person voted that we could do anything about media in the next 4 years. And that if the theme of this conversation is how do we unite an ununited, United States of America, is there anything we can do from a regulatory standpoint, from a commercial standpoint, in trying to create a more balanced, media apparatus here? Because I'm convinced without that, and if things continue the trajectory that we're going on right now, which is even more polarization, right? If say Trump starts his own media, I would assume it'd be further right to Fox, because that would be the most commercial. That's the lane that he would look to occupy in terms of the commercial space. And I'm sure there's examples on the left, but it seems like
there's an old idea that was passed before, that broadcasting and messages required that the broadcaster be balanced. One
Right.
political view had to be balanced by the other. And the
Right.
person that changed that was Ronald Reagan. Is that even possible, conceivable today? That's one answer to get more balance than there is at the moment.
Well, the media, the wavelengths are government assets, properties that are leased. So, I think that was the basis for that regulation that there had to be a balanced a set of opinions presented. Now I don't know what has happened, and that's so I wish I had an answer. It's just this growing frustration that unless we address that, this theme that we are here to sort of address tonight, this how do we unite in the United States of America, are we coming out of the box, out of the crippled, without having some at least idea or way of addressing that point.
Well, all I will say to you is that is pencil in March. That's the subject of our March presentation. And we have a bunch of ideas on how to solve it.
I would like to, I see a few more hands raised. Anna Dunshu from Chicago.
Hi, Herb. Thank you for calling on me. I'm one of those, I guess, younger generation folks. So I've attended a couple of sessions in the past, and I appreciate Herb always inviting us. I just wanted to highlight, because I know when, Michael Porter and Catherine, they came to speak the Chicago Club as well. Having politics as an industry, just like healthcare and all that, all of my colleagues, all of my board members, everyone cares about politics. We talk about it when we have board meetings. We're talking about Trump. We're talking about everything. So I do think we just need to market it a little bit better to get. Sorry for the noise, background noise. I have some animals trying to get my attention. But I wanted to
Sorry for interrupting. I just want to ask, what part of Chicago has the palm trees?
This
Is that by the lake? You're by Lake Michigan?
This is my Zoom background. I believe it's the Bahamas. I'm not sure, but I don't want to be. It's going to be out of the 7-day forecast. It's going to be snowing 5 of the 7 days. And it's good to see some of the familiar faces that I've worked with in the past as well here on the call. But I do want to highlight that social media and media, like for example, in Australia, 64, I was just Googling it to give you an exact number, 64.2% is owned by Rupert Murdoch News Corp. Same thing is happening in America. So you're having this polarization of the news by there's no laws in place allowing the purchase of those news medias and marketing. But I think the key part is social media, because the polarization is allowing, we're not putting any restrictions on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and we do have to do that in order to, we cannot exclude social media other than saying don't use social media for politics. That's actually going to get a bigger problem. And so we have to focus on that as well.
Let me ask a question. Is it true that people under 20 years of age pay less attention? They know social media is not always truthful and they get beyond that. Is that happening?
I'm not sure. So sorry, say that again. Under a certain age?
Under 20 years old.
Okay.
Are people paying less attention to social media because they know by experience it's not all that reliable?
Not sure, because I'm in my 40s, so I'm not sure what the statistics is, for example.
It may be a hope, because my grandchildren, I believe, feel that way.
Yeah. And I just think everyone we do have to make sure that Congress passes some laws to do standardization in elections, right? There's that slide, Peter, that you put about the things that we could do to standardize, the pre-election, but we have to be careful not to have a central, what we call in IT, a single point of failure. We can't have a centralized system because of the foreign powers and all that. We do need 50 ways to implement it. We just need standards and things like that. But we need to get it in Congress. It needs to be a law. It needs to be drafted. Who's going to draft that? And we need to pass it in the next 1 or 2 years, or it's never going to get implemented.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree with you completely.
We have one more. Peter, did you want to say something? Because I was.
No. Let's get
Okay, the next hand I
right
see
for
raised
hand.
by Daniel Houghton. And we're going to be wrapping it up pretty soon. But Daniel, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, thank you. When we talk about systemic change in our politics, most great political movements and changes in politics over history have had charismatic leaders, whether it's Abraham Lincoln or FDR, Martin Luther King, LBJ, whomever. Are there any up and coming Republican and or Democrats that you feel kind of might fit the bill in terms of meeting that need that's really almost required to have successful, systemic change in our total political system?
I wish I could give you some.
None come to mind?
I mean, I'm sure they're good people, and there's been so much noise. So much noise around the election. Some of those people may surface soon, but at the moment, I can't give you names.
You have
Um,
Biden now.
Antonio Delgado.
Before Antonio, I just saw one thing there was a question, since somebody's son is going to Cracker Barrel. The number was Joe Biden won 95% of the counties with a Whole Foods but no Cracker Barrel. And Donald Trump won 82% of the counties with a Cracker Barrel but no Whole Foods. That answers whoever
Thank
asked.
you very much. That was me. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Tell your son to enjoy Cracker Barrel.
Yeah.
I see another.
93 and 88. Is that what you said? 93% and 88?
It was 95 and 82.
Okay.
Okay.
So Whole Foods customers are more consistent than Cracker Barrel customers.
A question, I see a question by Mike Vavadsky. Is that the way you pronounce your last name? Mike? Unmute yourself.
Yeah, that's right. Here, let me turn my video on too. So thank you very much for hosting this. I'm really, I've background, lifelong Republican. I stopped being Republican about a decade ago because the party seemed to have left me. I don't belong to any party. And when Porter came out with the assessment that the political system isn't broken, it's doing exactly what it's designed to do. What we have to do is we have to figure out how to fix that system. And it struck me as a great solution, but maybe impossible to implement, because those who are in power today are in power because they've figured out how to work this system. And the whole, like, overturning the primary system and the continued voting, I forget what they call it, the forced rank voting, so that in the end, we end up with politicians that we feel represent us. Because I remember watching a program that he had done with his non-HBS colleague. And essentially the assessment was nobody was happy with the politicians running, right? People are voting for the least worst candidate, at least for the president. And so this was a system and how you fix it. And it seemed like a compelling fix, with the exception of how do we actually implement it? Because those who are in power aren't going to want to change it. And I'm hoping that as this group moves forward, that if you decide that is worth working against, how do we actually enable those changes to take place? I think that would be that would merit some serious time and effort, understanding how we might be able to get to the point where the primary system isn't picking our candidates, and therefore the minority in the country choosing who we have to vote for.
Well, what I would say is this, in answer to your question, in answer to Harry's comments and Dan's comments, our plan is in the next coming months, each month, to focus on a different one of these issues. And this is what reform elections now is going to attack this year, how to really make things happen. We're going to focus on each of the issues we've talked about.
And I think maybe it's obvious, but everything is on a state-by-state matter and is not a national solution. And if you look around the country, some states are implementing reforms that we sort of favor. Just one example, Peter might expand on it, but in the state of California, they have nonpartisan primary elections, not closed primaries or open primaries. It's nonpartisan primaries. And we like that idea because it allows independents to be involved in the process as candidates and as voters. And in that process, the candidates, in order to go to the general election, they have to reach out to more than just a narrow base. And we like that idea. And there are examples in California and other places around the country where they're working in the right direction. Peter,
Herb, let me add another. I'd like to add another state to that comment. If anybody on the call, they should look at Alaska, what they recently passed. There were 4 different measures: open primaries, ranked choice voting, campaign finance awareness. It's quite a remarkable set. So if we're looking for some place, some example where it was done and how it was done, look at Alaska.
Well, actually, the state I was going to mention is Nebraska. And the reason I was going to mention Nebraska is that in their state legislature, they have nonpartisan primaries and nonpartisan elections, sorry. And what's interesting about Nebraska, which is a bright red state, is there were more Democrats running committees in the Nebraska legislature than Republicans. And that's not because there were more Democrats than Republicans. It's just because those are the people that the politicians picked, that parties do not mean much in the Nebraska legislature, and it's a unicameral legislature.
I just want to make one other comment on, yes, we do see a lot of the focus on the state level, but when it comes to improving election process, one of the things that we are looking at is the Electoral Account Act, which was certainly a large part of the reason that so much was thrown up in the air as potentially turning the election during this last few weeks. And I think that is something, there are things that can be legislated at the national level, also in terms of representation acts.
And I would say the Electoral Account Act has about as good a chance of coming to pass as I do of playing for the Knicks next season.
I think you're mistaken, but we'll see.
You know, it's well past the hour, and I'm wondering whether this should come to an end. This has been a most interesting session. We have programs every single month. Peter has alluded to the fact that we plan to deal with different electoral reform issues in the coming months. You all can go to reformelectionsnow.org to learn more about who we are and read our white papers and see previous presentations. If you want a copy of this program, you can go to our website and let us know. We'll make it available to you. Mike, do you want to make any other concluding comments before we end?
Yeah, the main one I'd want to make is first to encourage you to come back in 2021, because we really do hope to come up with nonpartisan ideas that have a chance of being practically implemented. And I'd also ask you to bring back your children and grandchildren in those cases where you're not already in the under 40 category. So, or in the 40s.
Now, one thing I guess it goes without saying is that if you enjoy these sessions and want to continue, tell your friends who might be interested, because we're interested in growing our list of people who follow us, because we think that we have some interesting things to say, and we're dealing with a very educated audience, and so we learn a great deal from these sessions as well.
So thanks to everyone for attending. I wish you a good holiday. And I hope that 2021 is going to be much more healthy and happy than 2020 has been for too many people. Have a good
Good
evening.
Thank
holiday.
you.
Thank you.
And
Thanks.
for you, Peter, from my husband, Tom.
Herb, you might want to make sure we've got all the pieces from the chat that are something that we should
Yeah.
capture. I think I got most of them.
So long, Peter.
Thanks, Ken.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Thanks.
Well.